This evening, we begin with one of history's most ruthless periods, the lives of society's outcasts in medieval times. Forget the fairy tales. In reality, these women were fighting daily battles for survival, struggling with disease and trying to stay alive. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year was 1347, and Margaret pressed her face against the cold stone wall of her tiny chamber, listening to the sounds of the city awakening below. The bells of St. Mary's Cathedral rang out across the narrow, winding streets of London, calling the faithful to morning prayers. But Margaret would not be joining them. She couldn't. Not anymore. At 19, she had already lived what felt like several lifetimes. Her hands, once soft from her father's modest prosperity as a baker, were now rough and calloused. Her eyes, which had once sparkled with the innocent dreams of a merchant's daughter, now held the hard wisdom that came only from surviving in the darkest corners of medieval society. Margaret was a prostitute. In a world that offered women few choices and even fewer protections, she had found herself trapped in a life that most people preferred to pretend didn't exist. Yet exist it did, thriving in the shadows of every major city, town, and village across medieval Europe. The medieval world was not kind to women. In an age when a woman's value was measured primarily by her ability to bear children and serve her husband, those who fell outside these narrow confines faced a harsh reality. The church, which dominated every aspect of medieval life, preached that women were inherently sinful, the daughters of Eve, who had brought temptation and ruin to mankind. This theological foundation created a society where women had virtually no legal rights, could not own property in their own names, and were considered the property first of their fathers, then of their husband. For most women, marriage was not a matter of choice, but of economic necessity and family arrangement. Daughters were married off as young as 12 or 13, often to men they had never met, in unions designed to forge political alliances or strengthen trade relationships. Love was a luxury that few could afford, and even fewer expected. But what happened to the women who couldn't conform to these expectations? What became of those whose families couldn't afford dowries, who were widowed without family support, or who simply found themselves abandoned by the very society that demanded their submission? The answer lay in the brothels, taverns, and dark alleyways of medieval cities, where women like Margaret eked out precarious existences on the margins of respectable society. These women formed a hidden underclass, simultaneously despised and desired, condemned by the church yet tolerated by civic authorities who recognized the practical realities of human nature. The medieval brothel system didn't emerge overnight. It evolved from centuries of social, economic, and religious pressures that pushed certain women to the very edges of society. Unlike the romanticized image of the courtesan in Renaissance Italy or the geisha in Japan, medieval prostitutes operated in a world that offered them no protection, no respect, and precious little hope of escape. Most medieval cities had what were known as stews, officially sanctioned areas where prostitution was permitted and regulated. These districts were usually located outside the city walls or in the poorest, most squalid neighborhoods, far from the respectable quarters where merchants and nobles lived. The authorities didn't approve of prostitution, but they recognized that attempting to eliminate it entirely was both impossible and potentially more disruptive than allowing it to continue under controlled circumstances. In London, the stews of Southwark across the Thames from the city proper housed hundreds of women in conditions that would shock even the most hardened modern observer. The buildings were overcrowded, poorly constructed, and constantly threatened by fire, flood, and disease. Women lived packed together in tiny rooms, often sharing beds and what few possessions they could claim as their own. Margaret had arrived in Southwark 3 years earlier, though the journey that brought her there had begun much earlier. Her father's bakery had prospered for years, providing the family with a comfortable, if modest, lifestyle. Margaret had even learned to read, a rare accomplishment for a woman of her class, thanks to the local priest who had taken an interest in her quick mind and eager question. But prosperity in medieval times was always fragile. A bad harvest could drive up the price of grain beyond what ordinary people could afford. Political upheavals could disrupt trade routes and destroy established businesses overnight. Disease could strike without warning, leaving families devastated and destitute. For Margaret's family, disaster came in the form of a fire that swept through their neighborhood one dry summer evening. The bakery, along with their home and everything they owned, was reduced to ashes in a matter of hours. Her father, who had inhaled too much smoke while trying to save his precious ovens, developed a persistent cough that grew steadily worse over the following months. Within a year, he was dead. Without the bakery, the family had no income. Margaret's mother, never strong to begin with, fell into a depression from which she never recovered. She died the following winter, leaving Margaret and her younger brother Thomas to fend for themselves. Thomas, barely 14, was apprenticed to a blacksmith in a distant town, an arrangement that meant Margaret would likely never see him again. Alone in the world at 16, with no dowry, no family connections, and no marketable skills beyond basic literacy, Margaret faced the harsh reality that medieval society offered women in her position very few options. She could become a servant, working for wealthy families for little more than room and board. She could enter a convent, if she could find one willing to accept her without the customary donation that most religious houses require. Or she could try to survive on her own in a world that was not designed for independent women. She tried honest work first. For several months, she served as a maid in the household of a wool merchant, scrubbing floors, tending fires, and helping with the endless domestic tasks that kept a medieval household functioning. The work was hard, the hours long, and the pay barely enough to keep her fed and clothed. But it was respectable work, and Margaret clung to that respectability as long as she could. The end came when the merchant's eldest son, a young man named Robert, who had recently returned from university in Paris, began paying unwanted attention to her. At first, his advances were subtle, lingering looks, unnecessary touches when he passed her in the narrow hallways, compliments about her appearance that made her deeply uncomfortable. Margaret tried to avoid him, but in a medieval household, servants had little privacy and even less power to resist their employer's demands. When Robert finally cornered her in the pantry one evening and made his intentions clear, Margaret fought back. She scratched his face, kicked him in the shins, and ran. But her resistance only made him more determined. The next day, he told his father that Margaret had been stealing food from the household stores, a serious accusation that could result in imprisonment or worse. Without proof of her innocence or anyone willing to speak in her defense, Margaret found herself turned out onto the streets with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a reputation that would make finding other work nearly impossible. Word traveled fast in medieval communities, and a servant accused of theft, especially a young, attractive woman, would find few people willing to take a chance on her. It was during those desperate weeks, sleeping in doorways and begging for scraps of food, that Margaret first encountered the world she would eventually become part of. She noticed other women like herself, young, alone, and struggling to survive, who seemed to have found some way to feed and shelter themselves. They wore better clothes than she expected, had money for food and drink, and didn't seem to spend their days searching desperately for work. One of these women, a slightly older girl named Alice, took pity on Margaret's obvious distress. Alice had once been a merchant's daughter too, she explained, before her own family's fortunes collapsed. She knew what it was like to go from comfort to destitution overnight, to discover that the world that had once seemed secure could vanish without warning. Alice didn't explain immediately what she did for money. Instead, she bought Margaret a meal, the first real food she had eaten in days, and listened to her story with the kind of understanding that comes only from shared experience. When Margaret finished speaking, Alice was quiet for a long moment, staring into her cup of ale, with eyes that seemed much older than her 22 years. "There's work," Alice finally said. It's not what you were raised for. But it's work. And it's better than starving." Margaret didn't understand immediately what Alice meant. In her sheltered life as a baker's daughter, she had heard whispers about certain kinds of women, but the reality of prostitution was something she had never confronted directly. Even as Alice explained, gently but clearly, what the work involved, Margaret struggled to comprehend that this might become her life. The decision, when it finally came, wasn't really a decision at all. It was simply the recognition that she had run out of alternatives. Winter was coming, she had no money, no shelter, and no prospects for honest employment. She could continue living on the streets until cold and hunger killed her. Or she could accept Alice's offer of help, however distasteful that help might be. The brothel system in medieval England, like most aspects of medieval life, operated according to a complex web of official regulations and unofficial practices that often contradicted each other. Officially, the church condemned prostitution as a mortal sin. Unofficially, many church officials recognized that attempting to eliminate it entirely was both impossible and potentially counterproductive. Saint Augustine himself had argued that prostitution, while sinful, served a necessary social function by providing an outlet for male sexual desires that might otherwise be directed toward respectable women. This pragmatic approach to a moral problem became the foundation for medieval attitudes toward prostitution. It was wrong, but it was also inevitable, and therefore had to be managed rather than eliminated. In London, as in most major medieval cities, this management took the form of legal regulation and geographic segregation. The stews of Southwark operated under a complex set of rules established by local authorities and enforced by appointed officials. Brothel keepers had to be licensed. Women working in the stews had to register with the authorities, and both brothel keepers and prostitutes were subject to regular fines and taxes that provided revenue for local government. The regulations weren't designed to protect the women involved. Medieval authorities had little interest in the welfare of prostitutes. Instead, they were meant to contain what was seen as a necessary evil within manageable boundaries, to extract revenue from it, and to prevent it from disrupting the social order. Margaret learned about these regulations during her first weeks in Southwark. The brothel where Alice brought her was run by a woman named Eleanor, a former prostitute herself who had managed to accumulate enough money and connections to purchase her own establishment. Eleanor was in her 40s, which made her practically ancient by medieval standards, and she ruled her brothel with a combination of practical wisdom and ruthless efficiency. Eleanor explained the rules to Margaret on her first day. She would live in the brothel and work there 6 days a week. Sundays were officially rest days, though Eleanor noted dryly that business didn't always respect the church's schedule. Margaret would receive food, shelter, and clothing, but these would be deducted from her earnings, along with Eleanor's commission and various fees and fines imposed by the local authorities. The room Margaret was shown to was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a small chest for her few possessions. She would share it with another girl, a 15-year-old named Joan, who had been working in the brothel for almost a year. The walls were thin, the floor was dirt-covered with rushes that were changed infrequently, and the small window was covered with oiled parchment that let in a dim yellowish light during the day. Joan tried to be welcoming, but there was a hardness in her eyes that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of her own reflection in recent weeks. Joan had been the daughter of a soldier who died in one of the king's endless wars. Her mother had remarried quickly, but Joan's stepfather had made it clear that he had no interest in supporting another man's child. Joan had been turned out of her home at 14, and had found her way to Eleanor's brothel through a path not dissimilar to Margaret's own. As Margaret settled into her new life, She began to understand the complex social ecosystem that existed within the walls of the brothel. Eleanor maintained strict rules about cleanliness, behavior, and customer relations, not out of any concern for morality, but because her livelihood depended on maintaining a certain standard that would keep customers coming back and authorities from shutting her down. The women were expected to bathe regularly, a luxury in medieval times, and to keep their clothing and bedding as clean as possible. They were forbidden from forming romantic attachments with customers, a rule that Eleanor enforced with heavy fines and sometimes physical punishment. They were required to turn over all money they received to Eleanor, who would then distribute their share according to a complex formula that always seemed to leave the women owing more than they earned. But perhaps most importantly, they were expected to maintain absolute discretion about their customers. Many of the men who visited the brothel were married, prominent members of the community, or even church officials who publicly condemned the very establishment they secretly patronized. Eleanor's success depended on her ability to guarantee that what happened within her walls would never become public knowledge. This discretion extended to the women's interactions with each other. They learned not to ask too many questions about each other's pasts, not to share information that might be used against them, and not to form friendships that might become liabilities. It was a world built on mutual distrust and self-preservation, where survival often meant sacrificing the bonds of human connection that might have made their situation more bearable. Margaret's first customer was a merchant named Thomas who dealt in imported fabrics. He was a regular visitor to Eleanor's establishment, known for his gentle manner and his willingness to pay Eleanor's prices without haggling. Eleanor had chosen him deliberately for Margaret's initiation, knowing that a bad first experience could traumatize a new girl and make future work more difficult. Thomas was kind in his way. He spoke softly, moved carefully, and tried to make the experience as pleasant as possible under the circumstances. But kindness couldn't change the fundamental nature of what was happening, and Margaret left that first encounter feeling as though something essential had been taken from her that she would never be able to recover. In the days and weeks that followed, Margaret learned to navigate the complex emotional terrain of her new life. She developed techniques for mentally distancing herself from what was happening to her body, for maintaining some internal sense of self that remained untouched by the transactions that defined her days. She learned to read customers quickly, to identify those who might be dangerous or difficult, and to manage her own responses in ways that would protect her from both physical harm and emotional devastation. The other women in the brothel became her teachers, though the lessons they offered were harsh ones. They taught her which customers to avoid, how to protect herself from unwanted pregnancies, and how to treat the inevitable injuries and illnesses that came with the work. They showed her how to hide money from Eleanor's watchful eyes, how to obtain the herbs and potions that might prevent or end pregnancies, and how to maintain some semblance of hope in circumstances that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. But even as Margaret learned these survival skills, she remained acutely aware of how precarious her position was. She was entirely dependent on Eleanor's goodwill and the continued tolerance of local authorities, who could decide to shut down the brothel at any time. She had no legal protections, no recourse if customers became violent, and no guarantee that she would be able to continue working as she aged and became less attractive to potential clients. The medieval world offered women like Margaret no safety net, no path to redemption, and very little hope for a different future. They existed in a liminal space between the respectable world they had lost and the criminal underworld they had not quite joined, surviving day by day in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. As winter approached during Margaret's first year in Southwark, she began to understand that her old life, her identity as a baker's daughter, her dreams of marriage and family, her belief in a just and ordered world, was gone forever. She was learning to become someone else, someone harder and more cynical, someone capable of surviving in a world that wanted to use her and then forget she had ever existed. But survival, she was discovering, came at a cost that went far beyond money. It required a kind of emotional amputation, a willingness to cut away parts of herself that might once have been essential to her sense of who she was. The question that haunted her as she lay in her narrow bed at night, listening to Joan's quiet breathing and the sounds of the city beyond their thin walls, was whether what remained would still be recognizably human. The paths that led women into medieval brothels were as varied as they were tragic, each representing a different failure of the social systems that were supposed to protect and provide for society's most vulnerable members. Margaret's story was common but not universal. For every baker's daughter brought low by circumstance, there were countless other women whose journeys into prostitution began in different places and followed different routes. In the bed next to Margaret's, Joan often whispered stories of the other women who had come and gone from Eleanor's establishment over the years. There had been Sarah, the daughter of a Manners Reeve, who had been cast out when she became pregnant by the Lord's son. There was Catherine, whose husband had died of plague, leaving her with 3 young children and no means of support. And there was Mary, barely 13 when she arrived, who had been sold to Eleanor by her own father to pay gambling debts accumulated during the endless dice games that consumed his evenings in the local tavern. Each story followed a similar pattern. A woman or girl who had lost the protection of family, husband, or community found herself with nowhere to turn and no skills that could provide legitimate employment. In a society where women's worth was measured primarily by their relationships to men, those without such relationships discovered that survival often required them to commodify the one thing they possessed that men wanted to buy. The economic forces that drove women into prostitution were deeply embedded in medieval society's structure. The feudal system that dominated medieval Europe was built on rigid hierarchies and clearly defined roles. Peasants worked the land, nobles provided military service and protection, clergy tended to spiritual needs, and women served as wives and mothers. When any person fell outside these prescribed roles, the system had no mechanism for accommodating them. For women, this lack of accommodation was particularly devastating. Unlike men who could become soldiers, artisans, merchants, or clergy if their original social position became untenable, women had few alternatives to marriage and motherhood. Convents offered one possible refuge, but they required either substantial donations or exceptional religious devotion, and many were reluctant to accept women who came to them out of desperation rather than genuine calling. Domestic service provided another option, but servants were completely dependent on their employer's goodwill and had no protection against sexual exploitation, false accusations, or summary dismissal. As Margaret had discovered, a servant who lost her position under suspicious circumstances would find it nearly impossible to secure another, regardless of whether the accusations against her were true. The medieval economy's boom and bust cycles created constant streams of women who found themselves suddenly without protection or means of support. Crop failures, political upheavals, wars, and epidemics could destroy established social arrangements overnight, leaving thousands of people displaced and desperate. Women bore the heaviest burden of these disruptions, because they had the fewest resources for adapting to changed circumstances. Wars were particularly devastating for women. Medieval conflicts might be remembered for their battles and sieges, but their most lasting impact was often on the civilian populations who found themselves caught in the aftermath. When armies moved through an area, they frequently left behind not only destruction but also pregnant women who would be abandoned by their communities. The children of rape rarely brought anything but shame to their mothers, who might be blamed for the violence inflicted upon them. Widowmaking was another constant feature of medieval warfare. When men died in battle, their wives and daughters often discovered that their rights to property, protection, and support died with them. Medieval inheritance laws typically favored male heirs, and widows without adult sons frequently found themselves evicted from homes they had lived in for decades. Without family willing to take them in, these women faced destitution that could lead quickly to prostitution. But war wasn't the only force that created vulnerable women. The medieval economy's reliance on agriculture meant that harvest failures could devastate entire regions. When crops failed, families were forced to make brutal choices about who would eat and who would starve. Daughters were often considered more expendable than sons, who could provide agricultural labor or military service. Some families sold daughters into service or marriage. Others simply turned them out to fend for themselves. The story of Mary, the 13-year-old girl, whose father had sold her to Eleanor, illustrated another common path into prostitution. Gambling, drinking, and other vices that medieval moralists constantly preached against created financial pressures that some men resolved by treating their daughters as commodities. A girl's virginity had monetary value in medieval society, and desperate fathers sometimes sold that value to brothel keepers, tavern owners, or individual men who were willing to pay for it. These transactions were rarely conducted openly, but they were common enough that experienced brothel keepers like Eleanor maintained networks of contacts who could identify families in financial distress. A farmer facing foreclosure, a craftsman whose business had failed, or a widow struggling to feed multiple children might be approached with offers that seemed like salvation, but were actually something much darker. Eleanor herself had been introduced to prostitution through such a transaction, though the details varied from the stories told about other women. She had been born into a merchant family in York, but her father's business had collapsed when political conflicts disrupted the wool trade that was Yorkshire's economic foundation. Rather than see his family starve, Eleanor's father had arranged for her to become the mistress of a wealthy lord who needed a discreet companion for his travels. The arrangement had lasted for several years, during which Eleanor learned to read and write, acquired knowledge of business practices, and developed the social skills that would later serve her as a brothel keeper. When the lord died and his heir showed no interest in continuing the arrangement, Eleanor found herself in London with some money, considerable experience in managing difficult men, and few options for respectable employment. Her transition from mistress to brothel keeper had been gradual rather than sudden. She began by renting rooms to other women in circumstances similar to her own, then started taking a percentage of their earnings in exchange for providing security and managing their business arrangements. Over time, she formalized these relationships and expanded her operations until she controlled one of Southwark's more successful establishments. Eleanor's story illustrated an important aspect of medieval prostitution that distinguished it from both earlier and later periods: the degree to which the business was controlled by women rather than men. While male authorities regulated the industry and male customers provided the demand, the day-to-day operations of most brothels were managed by women who had themselves worked as prostitutes. These madams, as they came to be known, occupied a unique position in medieval society. They were technically criminals engaged in immoral activities, but they were also businesswomen who managed complex operations, maintained relationships with local authorities, and provided services that those authorities recognized as necessary. Some, like Eleanor, accumulated considerable wealth and influence, though they could never entirely escape the stigma attached to their profession. The relationship between madams and the women who worked for them was complex and often exploitative, but it was also one of the few contexts in medieval society where women wielded significant economic power over other women. Eleanor might extract the majority of her workers' earnings and maintain strict control over their lives, but she also provided them with shelter, protection, and a degree of security that they could not have achieved on their own. For women entering prostitution, the presence of female madams could be both reassuring and troubling. On one hand, Eleanor and women like her understood from personal experience what their workers were going through and could provide guidance that male brothel keepers might not have been able to offer. On the other hand, they were also skilled at identifying and exploiting the vulnerabilities that made women willing to accept exploitative arrangements. Eleanor's recruitment methods were sophisticated and psychologically manipulative. She rarely approached women directly. Instead, she relied on intermediaries like Alice, women who had already been working in the brothel for some time and could approach potential recruits as peers rather than employers. These intermediaries were instructed to offer help and friendship first, establishing emotional connections before discussing the nature of the work involved. The process Margaret had experienced, being offered food, shelter, and companionship by Alice before learning what would be expected in return, was typical of Eleanor's approach. By the time new women understood what they were agreeing to, they had already accepted help that created a sense of obligation and had been isolated from other sources of support. Eleanor also timed her recruitment efforts carefully, targeting women during moments of maximum vulnerability. She maintained contacts among servants in wealthy households who could identify maids who were facing dismissal. She cultivated relationships with tavern keepers and innkeepers who encountered desperate women traveling alone. She even had arrangements with some church officials who were willing to direct destitute women to her establishment rather than trying to find more respectable solutions to their problems. The church's role in facilitating prostitution was one of the more troubling aspects of the medieval system. While church doctrine officially condemned prostitution as sinful, many individual clergy members recognized that the alternatives available to destitute women were often worse than prostitution itself. A woman who starved to death was beyond redemption, but a woman who survived through prostitution might eventually find a path back to respectability. This pragmatic approach led some clergy members to develop informal relationships with brothel keepers like Eleanor. They might direct desperate women to her establishment while simultaneously preaching sermons about the evils of prostitution. They might even patronize the brothels themselves while maintaining public positions of moral authority. Father William, the priest at the church nearest to Eleanor's brothel, exemplified this contradiction. He regularly condemned prostitution from his pulpit and refused to allow known prostitutes to attend services with respectable members of his congregation. But he also quietly referred women in desperate circumstances to Eleanor, and he accepted donations from her establishment to support the church's charitable activities. The money that flowed from brothels to churches was another indication of how deeply prostitution was integrated into medieval society's economic structure. Eleanor paid regular fees to local authorities for the right to operate her establishment, but she also made voluntary donations to churches, monasteries, and charitable organizations. These payments served multiple purposes. They helped ensure that religious authorities would not campaign too vigorously against her business. They provided a form of insurance against sudden crackdowns, and they may have offered some psychological comfort to Eleanor herself, who retained enough Christian belief to worry about the state of her soul. For the women who worked in Eleanor's establishment, the religious dimensions of their situation were sources of constant anxiety. They had been raised in a Christian society that taught them to believe in heaven and hell, salvation and damnation. Their current circumstances seemed to place them firmly in the category of the damned, but they retained enough hope to continue seeking some form of redemption. Some women tried to maintain their faith by attending services at churches outside Southwark, where they were not known as prostitutes. Others developed private devotional practices, praying alone in their rooms and keeping small religious tokens hidden among their possessions. A few saved money with the hope of eventually making pilgrimages to shrines where they believed they might obtain forgiveness for their sins. Margaret found herself caught between religious guilt and practical necessity. She had been raised to believe that chastity was a woman's most precious possession, and that losing it outside marriage was a sin that could damn her soul to eternal punishment. Yet she also recognized that without the protection Eleanor's establishment provided, she would almost certainly die of starvation or violence within a matter of weeks. This conflict between religious teaching and survival necessity was one of the psychological burdens that made life in medieval brothels particularly difficult to endure. The women were not only selling their bodies, they were also, in their own understanding, selling their souls. The money they earned came at the cost of their hopes for salvation. creating a spiritual despair that accompanied the physical and emotional hardships of their daily lives. The other women in the brothel dealt with this spiritual crisis in different ways. Joan had abandoned religious belief entirely, declaring that a God who allowed such suffering either didn't exist or wasn't worth worshipping. Catherine, the widow with 3 children, convinced herself that God would understand that she was sacrificing herself to keep her children from starving. Mary, the youngest, alternated between periods of intense religious devotion and complete rejection of all spiritual concerns. Eleanor herself maintained a complex relationship with Christianity that allowed her to continue functioning as both a businesswoman and a believer. She regularly attended confession, though she was careful to choose priests who were willing to grant absolution in exchange for generous donations to their churches. She funded the construction of a small chapel near her brothel, and paid for daily masses to be said for the souls of women who had died while working for her. These religious practices served practical as well as spiritual functions. They demonstrated to local authorities that Eleanor was not completely outside the bounds of Christian society, and they provided a form of social insurance that might prove valuable if political or religious attitudes toward prostitution shifted. But they also reflected genuine belief and genuine anxiety about the ultimate fate of her soul and the souls of the women who worked for her. As Margaret's first winter in Southwark approached, she began to understand that the path that had brought her to Eleanor's establishment was less unusual than she had initially believed. Every woman in the brothel had a story of family dissolution, economic disaster, or social abandonment that had left them with no alternatives except prostitution or death. Their individual circumstances differed, but the underlying forces that had shaped their lives were remarkably consistent. These forces, the rigidity of social roles, the vulnerability of women without male protection, the boom and bust cycles of the medieval economy, and the absence of social safety nets, created a constant supply of women who could be drawn into prostitution. Eleanor's success as a brothel keeper depended on her ability to identify and exploit these vulnerable women. But the vulnerabilities themselves were products of systemic problems rather than individual failures. Understanding this didn't make Margaret's situation any easier to bear, but it did help her recognize that she was not alone in her suffering. The other women in the brothel were not her competitors or enemies. They were fellow victims of circumstances largely beyond their control. This recognition became the foundation for whatever solidarity and mutual support was possible within the brutal constraints of their shared existence. As the days grew shorter and the air grew colder, Margaret prepared for her first winter as a prostitute. She had learned the basic skills necessary for survival in her new environment, but she was beginning to understand that survival itself was only the first challenge. The greater challenge would be maintaining some sense of human dignity and hope in circumstances designed to strip both away, finding ways to preserve essential aspects of herself, while adapting to demands that seemed designed to destroy everything she had once been. Margaret's days in Eleanor's brothel followed a routine that was both monotonous and unpredictable, structured around the demands of customers whose arrivals could never be precisely timed, but whose needs had to be met regardless of the women's physical or emotional state. The rhythm of life in Southwark was dictated not by the church bells that marked the hours for respectable citizens, but by the ebb and flow of male desire and the practical requirements of maintaining a business that operated on the margins of legality. The women woke before dawn, not because they chose to, but because Eleanor insisted that the establishment be cleaned and prepared before the first customers arrived. Sleep was a luxury that came in fragments, interrupted by late-night visitors, early morning arrivals, and the constant noise that echoed through the thin walls of their overcrowded quarters. Margaret learned to function on 4 or 5 hours of sleep, supplemented by brief naps stolen during quiet periods in the afternoon. The building itself was a testament to the practical realities of running a medieval brothel. Eleanor had purchased a structure that had originally been designed as a warehouse, then modified it to serve her needs. The ground floor contained a common room where customers could drink ale, eat simple meals, and select companions for the evening. Behind this public space were 6 small chambers, each barely large enough for a bed and a wash basin, where the actual business transactions took place. The upper floor housed the women's living quarters, a series of tiny rooms that were more like cells than bedrooms. Margaret shared her space with Joan, and their few possessions were stored in a wooden chest that served as both storage and seating. The walls were made of wattle and daub, a mixture of wooden strips and clay that provided minimal insulation against London's damp climate. In winter, the rooms were freezing. In summer, they were stifling and filled with the stench of unwashed bodies and human waste. Water was a constant problem. The brothel had no well of its own, so water had to be carried from a public well several streets away. This task fell to the youngest women, who made multiple trips each day, carrying heavy buckets that left their arms aching and their backs strained. The water was used sparingly, for cooking, for the minimal washing that Eleanor insisted upon, and for the herb-infused douches that the women used in futile attempts to prevent pregnancy and disease. Cleanliness was both a practical necessity and a luxury that most medieval people could barely afford. Eleanor insisted that her women bathe at least once a week, a requirement that set them apart from the general population but consumed enormous amounts of water and fuel. The bathing took place in a large wooden tub in the basement, with women taking turns in water that grew progressively dirtier as each person used it. Soap was expensive and harsh, made from animal fat and lye that left skin red and irritated. The women's clothing was provided by Eleanor, but it came with conditions and costs that ensured they remained financially dependent on her establishment. Each woman received 2 dresses, one for working, one for sleeping, along with undergarments, stockings, and shoes. The working dresses were designed to be easily removed and to display the women's bodies in ways that would attract customers. They were made of cheap fabric that wore out quickly and had to be frequently replaced at the women's expense. Eleanor maintained detailed records of every item provided to each woman, along with the costs of food, shelter, medical treatment, and various fees and fines. These records were used to calculate how much money each woman owed to the establishment, and the calculations always seemed to result in debts that were larger than the women's earnings. This system ensured that leaving the brothel was financially impossible for most women, even if they could find alternative means of support. The food provided to the women was adequate for survival, but hardly appetizing. Breakfast consisted of bread, usually stale, and weak ale that was safer to drink than water but provided little nutrition. The main meal of the day was a stew made from whatever meat Eleanor could obtain cheaply, often the scraps and organs that butchers couldn't sell to more affluent customers. Vegetables were added when available, but fresh produce was expensive and spoiled quickly without proper storage. The women ate together in the common room before customers arrived, sharing wooden bowls and metal spoons that were passed from person to person. Conversation during meals was subdued and guarded. Eleanor discouraged the formation of close friendships among her workers, believing that emotional bonds might lead to conspiracies or attempts at collective action that could threaten her control over the establishment. Customer interactions formed the core of the women's working lives, but these interactions were far more complex and varied than the simple transactions that outsiders might have imagined. Men came to Eleanor's establishment for different reasons and with different expectations, and the women had to learn to read these motivations quickly and respond appropriately. Some customers were regular visitors who had developed preferences for particular women and routines that had been established over months or years of repeated encounters. These men were generally easier to manage because their desires were predictable. But they also posed unique challenges because they sometimes began to believe that they had formed genuine relationships with the women they favored. Margaret's first regular customer was a cloth merchant named William, who visited the brothel every Tuesday evening after conducting business at the weekly market. William was a married man with 3 children, but he had convinced himself that his relationship with Margaret was something more than a commercial transaction. He brought her small gifts, ribbons, pieces of fabric, occasionally sweets, and wanted to hear about her thoughts and feelings as much as he wanted sexual gratification. Margaret learned to manufacture a personality that would satisfy William's emotional needs while protecting her true self from the invasion of intimacy that his attention represented. She created stories about her past that were close enough to reality to be convincing but distant enough to prevent genuine connection. She expressed gratitude for his gifts and concern for his welfare while maintaining internal barriers that prevented his desires from penetrating her essential identity. Other customers were strangers passing through London on business or pilgrimage. Men who wanted quick, anonymous encounters that required minimal conversation or emotional investment. These transactions were often physically rougher, but emotionally easier to endure, because they demanded less psychological performance from the women involved. The most dangerous customers were those who came to the brothel drunk, angry, or seeking to act out violent fantasies that they could not express in their normal social relationships. Eleanor tried to screen out such men, but her financial incentives sometimes conflicted with her workers' safety. A customer who was willing to pay premium prices for unusual services might be admitted even if he posed obvious risks to the women who would have to satisfy his demands. Violence was a constant threat in the brothel, not only from customers but also from local authorities, rival establishments, and the general population of Southwark. The women had no legal protections and could not seek help from official sources without risking arrest and prosecution. They developed informal networks of mutual protection, warning each other about dangerous customers and providing assistance when violence occurred. Margaret learned to hide a small knife in her clothing and to position herself near exits when dealing with unfamiliar customers. She discovered which local taverns were frequented by men who were known to be violent toward prostitutes and learned to recognize the signs of customers who might become dangerous as the evening progressed. But these precautions provided only limited protection against men who were larger, stronger, and backed by a social system that considered violence against prostitutes to be regrettable but understandable. The financial arrangements that governed the women's work were complex and deliberately opaque. Eleanor claimed that each woman received a percentage of the money paid by her customers, but the actual calculations involved so many deductions and fees that most women never saw more than a small fraction of the revenue they generated. Room and board were deducted, along with clothing costs, medical expenses, fines imposed by local authorities, and Eleanor's commission for managing the business. Additional charges were imposed for special services or accommodations. If a customer wanted to spend an entire night with a particular woman, Eleanor charged extra fees for the loss of potential revenue from other customers. If a woman became pregnant and required time off work, she was charged for the costs of medical care and for the income lost during her absence. If she contracted a disease that made her temporarily unable to work, she was responsible for the costs of treatment and for compensating Eleanor for the disruption to business operations. This financial system created a form of debt bondage that made leaving the brothel extremely difficult. Most women found that debts to Eleanor increased over time rather than decreasing, regardless of how hard they worked or how much money they earned. The few women who managed to accumulate savings discovered that Eleanor could impose new charges or fines that eliminated their financial reserves almost overnight. Margaret kept careful mental records of the money she earned and the charges imposed against her earnings. But she quickly realized that Eleanor's accounting methods were designed to be incomprehensible and therefore impossible to challenge. When she attempted to question specific charges, Eleanor responded with elaborate explanations that involved so many variables and considerations that Margaret was left more confused than before. The other women in the brothel had developed various strategies for dealing with the financial manipulation they all experienced. Some attempted to hide small amounts of money from Eleanor's accounting, though the risks of discovery were severe and the punishments brutal. Others focused on developing relationships with customers who might provide gifts or assistance outside the official brothel economy. A few simply accepted their financial bondage as permanent and focused on surviving day by day without worrying about long-term financial independence. The passage of time in the brothel was marked not by the normal rhythms of medieval life, but by the cycles of customer demand and the women's physical capacity to meet that demand. Feast days and holy days might reduce business temporarily, but they also created pent-up demand that resulted in busier periods once the official celebrations ended. Market days brought increased traffic as merchants and farmers came to town with money to spend. Political events, military campaigns, and seasonal changes all affected the flow of customers in ways that the women had to anticipate and accommodate. Margaret's first Christmas in the brothel was particularly difficult. She watched through the small window of her room as families hurried through the streets on their way to church services, carrying small gifts and wearing their best clothing. The contrast between their celebration of Christ's birth and her own circumstances seemed to embody all the ways in which her life had diverged from the expectations she had been raised with. Eleanor allowed the women to attend Christmas Mass at a church outside Southwark, but they had to go before dawn and return quickly to prepare for the increased business that the holiday season always brought. Margaret knelt in the cold stone church, surrounded by respectable citizens whose lives represented everything she had lost, and tried to pray for forgiveness, salvation, or at least the strength to continue enduring her circumstances. The sermon that morning focused on Mary's acceptance of God's will and her willingness to sacrifice her own comfort for a higher purpose. Margaret listened to the priest's words about humility, obedience, and the rewards that awaited those who suffered patiently in this life. But she found it difficult to see any connection between Mary's holy suffering and her own degradation. If God had a plan that included her current circumstances, it was a plan that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance, rather than to demonstrate divine love. As winter deepened and the days grew shorter, Margaret's daily routine became increasingly mechanical and disconnected from her emotional life. She learned to function efficiently during customer interactions while keeping her true thoughts and feelings locked away in spaces that the transactions could not reach. She developed techniques for managing physical pain, emotional numbness, and the constant fatigue that came from working long hours under stressful conditions. But efficiency came at a cost that went beyond the physical and financial exploitation she experienced. The psychological defenses that allowed her to survive also prevented her from forming genuine connections with other people, including the other women who shared her circumstances. She began to lose touch with memories of her former life and with hopes for any future beyond the narrow confines of Eleanor's establishment. The person she had been, the baker's daughter who had dreamed of marriage and family, was becoming a stranger whose experiences seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The stench of sickness hung perpetually in the air of Eleanor's establishment, a mixture of unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and the herbal concoctions that the women used in desperate attempts to treat ailments that medieval medicine barely understood. Disease was not an occasional visitor but a permanent resident, claiming lives with such regularity that Eleanor maintained relationships with several men who specialized in the discreet disposal of bodies that could not be buried in consecrated ground. Margaret's education in the realities of medieval healthcare began during her second week in the brothel, when Joan developed a fever that left her delirious and burning to the touch. There was no physician willing to treat a prostitute, and even if there had been, Eleanor would not have paid the fees that medical treatment required. Instead, the women relied on remedies passed down from older workers, a collection of folk wisdom, superstition, and occasionally effective treatments that represented their only defense against the diseases that thrived in their overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Joan's fever was treated with cold compresses made from rags soaked in water that had been boiled with willow bark. a remedy that occasionally helped but more often simply made the patient more comfortable. While the disease ran its course, Margaret learned to prepare these compresses, to force liquid down the throats of women too sick to drink voluntarily, and to clean up the bodily fluids that serious illness inevitably produced. She also learned to recognize the signs that indicated when a woman was beyond help and would not recover. Knowledge that was both practical and heartbreaking. Joan survived her fever, but the experience left her weakened and more susceptible to future illnesses. Margaret observed how quickly a woman's earning capacity could disappear when sickness made her less attractive to customers or unable to work entirely. Eleanor showed little patience with sick workers, deducting the costs of care from their earnings and making it clear that prolonged illness was a luxury that the business could not afford. The most feared diseases in the brothel were those that affected the women's ability to work or that might spread to customers and create problems with local authorities. Syphilis, though not yet identified by that name, was already devastating prostitute populations across Europe. The disease progressed slowly, beginning with sores that could be hidden or dismissed as minor ailments, then advancing through stages that left victims increasingly debilitated and disfigured. Eleanor claimed to inspect her workers regularly for signs of disease, but her examinations were superficial and motivated more by business concerns than medical knowledge. A woman who showed obvious symptoms might be forced to leave the establishment, but by then she had usually infected multiple customers and fellow workers. The disease spread through Eleanor's brothel like fire through dry timber, claiming victims with a randomness that made every day a gamble with death. Margaret watched established workers disappear suddenly, sometimes in the middle of the night when Eleanor decided they had become liabilities to the business. These women were simply turned out onto the streets with whatever possessions they could carry, left to die slowly and painfully while new workers took their places. The knowledge that this could be her own fate created a constant undercurrent of anxiety that affected every aspect of Margaret's daily life. Pregnancy was another constant threat that the women faced, with a combination of dread and resigned acceptance. Medieval contraception consisted primarily of herbal preparations whose effectiveness was largely mythical, and practices that were often more dangerous than the pregnancies they were meant to prevent. Women inserted various substances into their bodies before and after sexual encounters, drank concoctions made from toxic plants, and performed rituals that had no medical basis but provided psychological comfort. Margaret learned to prepare and use these remedies from the other women, though she quickly realized that their main effect was to create an illusion of control over circumstances that were essentially beyond her influence. She drank bitter teas made from pennyroyal and rue, herbs that could cause miscarriages but could also cause fatal poisoning if used in excessive quantities. She learned to time her sexual encounters with her menstrual cycle, though the irregular schedules and constant stress of brothel life made such timing largely guesswork. When pregnancies did occur, as they inevitably did, the women faced limited and dangerous options. Some attempted to induce miscarriages using increasingly desperate methods, from violent exercise to the consumption of substances that were essentially poisons. Others carried their pregnancies to term, giving birth in conditions that made survival unlikely for both mother and child. Eleanor discouraged pregnancies, not out of concern for the women's welfare, but because they disrupted business operations and created additional expenses. Pregnant women became less attractive to customers and eventually unable to work entirely, while childbirth itself was so dangerous that it frequently resulted in the loss of experienced workers who had taken years to train and develop customer followings. The few babies who were born in Eleanor's establishment faced grim prospects. Some died within days of birth from infections, malnutrition, or the harsh conditions that surrounded them. Others were sold to families who wanted children but could not produce their own. Transactions that provided Eleanor with additional revenue while ensuring that the babies would not become ongoing financial burdens. The mothers rarely had any say in these arrangements and were expected to return to work as soon as they were physically capable of doing so. Margaret witnessed several births during her time in the brothel, experiences that taught her about both the miraculous resilience of human life and the casual cruelty of circumstances that could snuff out that life without remorse. She helped deliver Catherine's fourth child, a daughter who lived for 6 days before succumbing to a fever that no remedy could break. She also assisted when Mary, still barely 15 years old, gave birth to a son whose father could have been any of dozens of customers. The medical knowledge available to the women was a mixture of useful observations, dangerous misconceptions, and pure superstition. They knew that certain herbs could reduce fever, and that keeping wounds clean helped prevent infection. But they also believed that diseases could be caused by evil spirits, unfavorable astrological conditions, or moral failings that required spiritual rather than medical treatment. Eleanor maintained a collection of medical texts and remedies that she had acquired over years of managing women, whose health problems were both constant and varied. Some of these treatments were genuinely helpful: willow bark for pain relief, honey for wound care, and certain herbal preparations that could reduce inflammation or fight infection. Others were useless or actively harmful, based on medieval theories about bodily humors and the supposed medicinal properties of exotic substances. The women learned to treat their own ailments because professional medical care was both expensive and rarely available to people in their social position. They became skilled at setting broken bones, treating cuts and bruises, and managing the chronic pain that resulted from their working conditions. They developed informal networks for sharing medical knowledge and resources, creating a collective wisdom that was often more practical than the theoretical knowledge possessed by trained physicians. But their amateur medical care had severe limitations, particularly when dealing with serious diseases or injuries. Margaret watched women die from conditions that might have been treatable if they had access to better care, proper nutrition, and cleaner living conditions. She saw infections spread through wounds that could have healed with proper treatment, and witnessed the progression of diseases that eventually claimed victims who might have survived with different circumstances. The psychological impact of constant illness and death was as devastating as the physical effects. The women lived with the knowledge that any day might bring a disease or injury that would end their lives or destroy their ability to earn money. They watched friends and companions disappear regularly, either through death or through Eleanor's decision to remove workers who had become too sick to be profitable. This constant exposure to mortality created a fatalistic attitude that affected every aspect of life in the brothel. Women made decisions based on short-term survival rather than long-term planning, because they had no reason to believe that long-term survival was possible. They formed attachments cautiously, knowing that the people they cared about were likely to disappear without warning. They hoarded small comforts and pleasures because they understood that such opportunities might not come again. Margaret found herself becoming increasingly focused on the immediate physical sensations of her daily life: the taste of food, the warmth of sunlight through a window, the relief of lying down after hours of standing. These simple pleasures became more precious as she realized how easily they could be lost to illness, injury, or death. She learned to find moments of peace and even happiness within circumstances that seemed designed to destroy all possibility of human contentment. The arrival of winter brought additional health challenges as the women struggled to stay warm in buildings that were poorly heated and inadequately insulated. Respiratory infections spread rapidly in the close quarters where they lived and worked, and the combination of poor nutrition, physical exhaustion, and constant stress left their immune systems unable to fight off diseases that better nourished people might have survived. Eleanor responded to these seasonal health crises by imposing additional restrictions and requirements that were supposed to prevent the spread of disease. but that often made the women's lives more difficult without providing any real protection. She instituted daily inspections that were humiliating and largely ineffective, required the use of herbal preparations that were expensive and usually worthless, and threatened to expel any woman who showed signs of serious illness. Margaret survived her first winter in the brothel, but she watched several other women succumb to diseases that might have been minor inconveniences for people with better living conditions and access to proper medical care. Their deaths served as constant reminders of her own vulnerability and of the narrow margin that separated survival from disaster in her new world. As spring arrived and the worst of the winter illnesses began to subside, Margaret found herself changed by months of exposure to constant sickness and death. She had developed a practical knowledge of basic medical care that would serve her well in the years ahead. But she had also lost much of her innocence about the fragility of human life and the indifference of the world to individual suffering. The experience had taught her that survival required not only physical resilience, but also the ability to maintain hope in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy it. She learned to find meaning in small acts of kindness toward her fellow workers, to take pride in her growing competence at managing medical crises, and to appreciate the simple fact of waking up alive each morning in a place where death was always a close neighbor. The church bells of St. Saviour's Cathedral rang out across Southwark every morning at dawn, their bronze voices carrying a message of salvation and divine grace that seemed to mock the women who lived in the shadows of respectability. For Margaret and her companions, those bells served as daily reminders of their exclusion from the Christian community that claimed to embrace all souls while systematically rejecting those whose circumstances made them inconvenient or uncomfortable. Father Benedict, the priest responsible for the spiritual welfare of Southwark's residents, preached regularly about the evils of prostitution and the moral corruption that threatened to destroy Christian society. His sermons painted prostitutes as agents of Satan, women who had chosen damnation over virtue and who sought to drag innocent men down with them into the depths of sin. Yet these same sermons were often delivered to congregations that included the very men who patronized Eleanor's establishment, creating a hypocrisy that everyone recognized but no one dared to acknowledge openly. The church's official position on prostitution was complex and contradictory, reflecting centuries of theological debate about the nature of sin, redemption, and social necessity. St. Augustine had famously argued that prostitution, while sinful, served a valuable function by channeling male sexual desires away from wives and daughters who needed to remain pure. This utilitarian approach to moral questions had become deeply embedded in church doctrine, creating a system where prostitution was simultaneously condemned and tolerated. Margaret experienced this contradiction directly during her few attempts to attend religious services in churches outside Southwark. When she tried to join the congregation at St. Mary's in Bermondsey, covering her hair and wearing her most modest clothing, she was recognized by a merchant's wife who had seen her in Eleanor's establishment. The woman's horrified whispers spread quickly through the church, and Margaret found herself surrounded by hostile stares and muttered accusations that made it impossible to focus on the service. The priest, Father Thomas, approached her after the service with what he claimed was pastoral concern. He spoke to her about the state of her soul and the possibility of redemption through genuine repentance, but his questions quickly turned to practical matters: how much money she had saved, whether she was willing to enter a convent, and what guarantees she could provide that she would never return to her former life. When Margaret admitted that she had no savings and no alternatives to her current circumstances, Father Thomas's manner became cold and dismissive. The encounter taught Margaret that the church's offer of redemption came with conditions that made it inaccessible to women in her position. True repentance required not only spiritual transformation but also financial resources and social connections that prostitutes rarely possessed. The church was willing to forgive sins, but only for those who could demonstrate their reformation through material evidence of their changed circumstances. This pattern of conditional acceptance extended to all aspects of Margaret's relationship with respectable society. The shopkeepers who sold food and clothing to Eleanor's establishment were willing to take money that came from prostitution, but they insisted on conducting these transactions quickly and discreetly, often requiring the women to use back entrances or to shop during hours when their presence would not disturb other customers. The local authorities maintained an equally hypocritical relationship with the brothels under their jurisdiction. The Constable of Southwark, Sir Geoffrey de Mortimer, collected regular fees and fines from Eleanor's establishment while publicly supporting campaigns to clean up the moral climate of his district. His deputies conducted periodic raids that were announced in advance through informal networks, allowing Eleanor to prepare by hiding her youngest workers and ensuring that all required licenses and payments were current. These theatrical displays of law enforcement served multiple purposes. They demonstrated official disapproval of prostitution to critics who demanded action. They provided opportunities for local authorities to extract additional payments from brothel operators, and they maintained the fiction that prostitution was an aberration rather than an integral part of the social and economic system. Margaret learned to recognize the signs that preceded these raids, and to prepare accordingly. Certain customers who had connections to local government would warn Eleanor when enforcement actions were being planned. The women would spend the preceding days cleaning the establishment obsessively, hiding any evidence of activities that went beyond what was officially tolerated, and rehearsing stories that would minimize their legal vulnerability if they were questioned by authorities. The raids themselves were usually brief and perfunctory. Officials would inspect the premises, review Eleanor's records, collect whatever fines or fees were deemed appropriate, and depart with stern warnings about maintaining proper standards. The women would be questioned briefly but rarely arrested unless they had committed specific offenses or unless political pressures required more dramatic action. But the psychological impact of these raids extended far beyond their immediate legal consequences. They served as regular reminders of the women's vulnerability and their complete dependence on the tolerance of authorities who could withdraw that tolerance at any time. The knowledge that their freedom and safety were subject to the whims of men who despised them while simultaneously profiting from their degradation created a constant state of anxiety that affected every aspect of their lives. The social isolation that prostitution imposed was perhaps more devastating than the legal and religious persecution the women faced. Margaret discovered that her former life, her identity as a baker's daughter, her friendships with other young women in her neighborhood, her dreams of marriage and family, had been completely severed by her entry into Eleanor's establishment. She could not contact her brother Thomas without risking his reputation and future prospects. She could not visit the places where she had grown up without being recognized and shunned by people who had once treated her with respect. This isolation was deliberately maintained by the social systems that surrounded prostitution. Respectable women were forbidden from associating with prostitutes, not only by formal rules, but by informal pressures that made such associations socially and economically dangerous. A merchant's daughter who was seen talking to a known prostitute might find her own reputation questioned and her marriage prospects damaged. A servant who showed sympathy for fallen women might lose her position if her employer learned of her association. The few relationships that prostitutes could maintain with people outside their profession were usually exploitative in nature. Some formed attachments to customers who claimed to care for them, but who were primarily interested in the fantasy of rescuing fallen women. Others developed dependencies on merchants, landlords, or officials, who provided protection or assistance in exchange for sexual favors or information about other customers. Margaret experienced this dynamic with a cloth merchant named Robert, who began visiting Eleanor's establishment regularly and requesting her specifically. Robert presented himself as different from other customers, claiming that he was interested in her as a person rather than simply as a sexual commodity. He brought her gifts, asked about her thoughts and feelings, and spoke about the possibility of helping her escape her current circumstances. For several months, Margaret allowed herself to believe that Robert's interest might be genuine, and that he might provide the opportunity for redemption that she desperately sought. She began to imagine a future in which she could leave Eleanor's establishment, perhaps become Robert's mistress or even his wife, and regain some measure of respectability and security. The illusion was shattered when Margaret discovered that Robert was married and that his wife was pregnant with their fourth child. His visits to the brothel were not motivated by love or even genuine affection, but by a desire for sexual variety and the thrill of associating with women from a world that was forbidden to him in his normal social life. When Margaret confronted him about his deception, Robert responded with anger and contempt, making it clear that he had never considered her to be anything more than a temporary diversion. The experience taught Margaret that the emotional attachments that developed between prostitutes and their customers were almost always illusory, based on projections and fantasies that had little connection to genuine human relationships. The men who patronized Eleanor's establishment might claim to care for individual women, but they were fundamentally incapable of seeing those women as complete human beings deserving of respect and consideration. This realization led Margaret to adopt a more defensive approach to customer interactions, maintaining the emotional distance that was necessary for psychological survival while providing the illusion of intimacy that customers sought. She learned to perform affection and interest convincingly while protecting her authentic feelings from exploitation, a skill that was essential for maintaining sanity in circumstances that constantly threatened to destroy her sense of self. The other women in Eleanor's establishment had developed similar defensive strategies, though their specific approaches varied according to their personalities and experiences. Some became cynical and bitter, treating all customers with barely concealed contempt. Others maintained a cheerful facade that masked deeper despair. A few found ways to derive genuine satisfaction from their ability to provide comfort to lonely or troubled men, even while recognizing the fundamental inequality of these relationships. Joan had developed perhaps the most effective emotional armor, maintaining a sardonic sense of humor that allowed her to find absurdity and even occasional joy in circumstances that might otherwise have been unbearable. She treated her interactions with customers as elaborate theatrical performances, taking pride in her ability to convince men that they were experiencing genuine intimacy while keeping her true thoughts and feelings completely hidden. The women's relationships with each other were complicated by the competitive dynamics that Eleanor's business model created. Each woman's earnings affected her status within the establishment and her ability to secure better working conditions or protection from difficult customers. This economic competition made genuine friendship difficult to maintain, though most women recognized that some degree of cooperation was necessary for collective survival. Margaret found herself drawn to Catherine, the widow whose situation most closely resembled her own. But their friendship was constrained by the knowledge that they were essentially competing for the same resources and opportunities. They could offer each other emotional support and practical assistance, but they could not fully trust each other with information that might affect their individual prospects for survival or advancement. The arrival of new women in Eleanor's establishment regularly disrupted whatever stability these relationships had achieved. Younger, more attractive women posed economic threats to established workers, while women from different social backgrounds brought different expectations and attitudes that could create tension within the group. Eleanor encouraged these divisions, knowing that women who were focused on competing with each other were less likely to unite against her authority. As Margaret's second year in the brothel began, she found herself occupying an increasingly isolated position within an already isolated community. She had survived longer than many women who had arrived before her, but this survival had come at the cost of emotional connections that might have made her circumstances more bearable. She had learned to function effectively within the brutal constraints of her environment, but she had also lost much of her capacity for hope, trust, and authentic human connection. The religious and social condemnation that surrounded her daily life had become internalized, creating a voice of self-judgment that echoed the external voices that pronounced her damned and worthless. She began to accept that redemption was impossible, and that her current circumstances represented not a temporary setback, but a permanent fall from grace that could never be reversed. In the depths of winter, during Margaret's second year at Eleanor's establishment, a new woman arrived who would change everything the residents thought they knew about survival and solidarity. Her name was Agnes, and she was unlike anyone Margaret had encountered in the brothel world. At 32, she was considered ancient by prostitution standards, yet she possessed a quiet authority and practical wisdom that immediately commanded respect from both Eleanor and the younger women. Agnes had worked in brothels across 3 different cities, surviving plague outbreaks, violent customers, corrupt officials, and the countless small cruelties that defined life on society's margins. She had learned not just how to endure, but how to create pockets of dignity and mutual support within circumstances designed to destroy both. Her arrival marked the beginning of subtle changes in the establishment's internal dynamics that would prove crucial for Margaret's psychological survival. Unlike the other women, Agnes refused to accept the isolation and competition that Eleanor encouraged. She began holding quiet conversations in the pre-dawn hours when Eleanor was asleep, sharing information about customers, discussing strategies for managing difficult situations, and gradually building networks of trust among women who had been taught to view each other as rivals rather than allies.
Margaret was initially suspicious of Agnes's overtures. 2 years of brothel life had taught her that kindness usually came with hidden costs and that trust was a luxury that could prove fatal. But Agnes demonstrated her sincerity through small acts of practical assistance that required no reciprocal obligations. When Margaret developed a persistent cough that threatened to make her less appealing to customers, Agnes provided herbal remedies and covered for her during particularly difficult encounters until she recovered.
The strategies Agnes taught were not revolutionary or dramatic. They were practical techniques for preserving sanity and dignity in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy both. She showed the women how to create private spaces within their shared quarters using hanging cloths and strategically placed furniture. She taught them methods for hiding small amounts of money that Eleanor couldn't easily discover and confiscate. Most importantly, she demonstrated how women could provide emotional support for each other without creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Agnes had survived by understanding that individual resistance to their circumstances was usually futile, but that collective strategies could create meaningful improvements in their daily lives. She organized informal systems for sharing resources, protecting vulnerable women from particularly dangerous customers, and maintaining morale during the darkest periods when death and despair seemed inevitable. One of her most effective innovations was the creation of what she called family groups, clusters of 3 or 4 women who looked out for each other's welfare and shared resources when individual women faced crises. These groups were small enough to avoid Eleanor's suspicion, but large enough to provide meaningful support when members faced illness, difficult customers, or periods of reduced earnings. Margaret found herself part of a family group that included Agnes, Joan, and a newer arrival named Sarah, who had been a miller's daughter before drought destroyed her family's livelihood. The group operated according to informal rules that balanced individual self-interest with collective welfare. Members shared information about customer preferences in dangerous situations, pooled resources when one member faced financial crises, and provided emotional support during periods of despair or trauma. The system worked because it acknowledged the competitive realities of brothel life, while creating structures that mitigated their most destructive effects. Women could still compete for preferred customers and better working conditions, but they also had support networks that provided security during periods when competition alone was insufficient for survival. Agnes also taught the women more sophisticated techniques for managing customer relationships and protecting themselves from exploitation. She showed them how to identify customers who might become violent before situations escalated, how to extract additional payments for unusual services, and how to maintain psychological distance during encounters that demanded apparent intimacy. Perhaps most importantly, Agnes demonstrated that it was possible to maintain a sense of personal dignity even within circumstances that society had designed to strip away all human worth. She carried herself with quiet pride, spoke to customers with polite firmness rather than subservience, and refused to accept treatment that went beyond the basic requirements of her professional obligations. This attitude was initially puzzling to Margaret, who had learned to survive by making herself as inconspicuous and accommodating as possible. Agnes's approach seemed risky, potentially provoking conflicts with customers or Eleanor that could result in punishment or expulsion. But Margaret gradually observed that Agnes's quiet authority actually made her more successful, not less. Customers treated her with greater respect. Eleanor relied on her judgment in managing difficult situations, and other women looked to her for leadership during crises. The transformation in Margaret's own approach was gradual but significant. Under Agnes's guidance, she learned to set boundaries with customers that protected her psychological well-being without jeopardizing her economic survival. She discovered that many men actually preferred interactions with women who maintained some degree of personal dignity, finding the illusion of mutual respect more satisfying than obvious subservience. More importantly, Margaret began to reclaim aspects of her identity that she had thought were permanently lost. Agnes encouraged the women to share stories about their lives before prostitution, not as exercises in nostalgia or self-pity, but as ways of maintaining connections to parts of themselves that their current circumstances couldn't touch. Margaret found herself talking about her father's bakery, her childhood friendships, and her dreams of learning to read more advanced texts. These conversations didn't change her present circumstances, but they reminded her that she was more than the sum of her current experiences, and that survival didn't require complete surrender of her authentic self. Agnes also introduced the women to practical skills that could potentially provide alternative sources of income. She taught basic literacy to those who couldn't read, shared knowledge about herbal medicine that had value beyond the brothel, and demonstrated needlework techniques that could be used to earn money during slow periods or after age made prostitution impossible. These skills were taught quietly and incrementally, without Eleanor's knowledge or permission. Agnes understood that Eleanor's business model depended on the women's complete financial dependence, and that providing them with alternative capabilities could be seen as subversive. But she also recognized that survival often required multiple strategies, and that women who possessed diverse skills had better chances of adapting to changing circumstances. The most significant change Agnes brought to the establishment was the gradual development of what could only be called hope. Not the naive optimism that circumstances would somehow improve without effort, but the realistic confidence that survival was possible, and that small improvements in their situation could be achieved through intelligence, cooperation, and persistent effort. This hope manifested in practical ways. Women began taking better care of their health because they believed they might live long enough for such care to matter. They started saving small amounts of money despite Eleanor's accounting manipulations, because they believed that accumulating resources was worthwhile. They began learning skills and gathering information because they believed that knowledge might eventually prove useful. Margaret found herself planning beyond the immediate requirements of daily survival for the first time since entering the brothel. She began thinking about what she might do if she ever managed to leave Eleanor's establishment, considering possibilities that had seemed impossible during her first 2 years in prostitution. These plans were tentative and realistic rather than fantastical, but they represented a fundamental shift in her relationship to her own future. The changes Agnes brought to the establishment didn't go unnoticed by Eleanor, who recognized that anything that gave her workers greater independence posed potential threats to her control over the business. She began imposing new restrictions designed to limit the women's ability to cooperate and communicate, separating family groups by assigning different working schedules and threatening punishment for women caught sharing resources or information. But Agnes had anticipated this resistance and had taught the women to adapt their cooperation strategies to avoid Eleanor's detection. The family groups continued to function, but they operated more discreetly, using coded communications and indirect methods for sharing resources and support. The networks Agnes had established proved resilient enough to survive Eleanor's attempts at disruption while remaining flexible enough to evolve as circumstances changed.
The winter when Agnes arrived also brought external challenges that tested the strength of the solidarity networks she had helped create. A particularly severe outbreak of disease killed 3 women within a month, including one member of Margaret's family group. The remaining members faced not only grief and fear, but also increased financial pressures as they tried to compensate for reduced collective resources. Agnes guided the survivors through this crisis by demonstrating how mutual support could be maintained even during periods of loss and scarcity. The remaining family groups absorbed members whose groups had been broken by death or departure, maintaining the emotional and practical benefits of collective cooperation while adapting to changed circumstances. Margaret discovered that the support networks Agnes had taught them to create were more than mere survival strategies. They were ways of maintaining humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. The simple act of caring for other people and accepting care from them provided meaning and purpose that individual survival alone could not supply. As spring approached and Margaret entered her 3rd year in Eleanor's establishment, she found herself changed in ways that went beyond the obvious adaptations to brothel life. She had learned not just how to survive, but how to help others survive. Not just how to endure degradation, but how to maintain dignity within it. Not just how to exist from day to day, but how to find reasons for wanting tomorrow to arrive. The strategies Agnes had taught were not solutions to the fundamental problems that trapped women in prostitution, but they were ways of living with those problems that preserved essential aspects of human experience. Margaret had learned that even in the darkest circumstances, people could find ways to care for each other, to maintain hope, and to create pockets of meaning that made survival worthwhile. These lessons would prove crucial as Margaret faced the challenges that lay ahead, challenges that would test not only her individual resilience, but also the strength of the bonds she had learned to form with women who shared her circumstances and understood her struggles in ways that no one else ever could. Agnes disappeared on a Tuesday morning in late spring, during Margaret's 3rd year at Eleanor's establishment. There was no farewell, no explanation, no indication that she had been planning to leave. Margaret woke to find Agnes's bed empty and her few possessions gone, as if she had simply dissolved into the London mist that clung to the Thames each dawn. Eleanor claimed to know nothing about the departure, but her obvious relief suggested that Agnes's influence had become more threatening than she was willing to tolerate. The loss devastated the fragile networks of solidarity that Agnes had helped create. Without her steady presence and practical wisdom, the family groups began to fracture under the pressures that had always surrounded them. Some women retreated into the isolation and competition that had characterized the establishment before Agnes's arrival. Others tried to maintain the cooperative strategies they had learned, but without Agnes's guidance, their efforts were less effective and more easily disrupted by Eleanor's management techniques. Margaret found herself thrust into a leadership role she had never sought and felt unprepared to handle. The other women looked to her for the kind of guidance Agnes had provided, but Margaret lacked both Agnes's experience and her natural authority. She tried to maintain the systems Agnes had established, but she could feel them slowly dissolving under the weight of fear, suspicion, and the relentless pressures of daily survival. The months following Agnes's departure marked a turning point not only for Margaret personally, but for the entire world of medieval prostitution. Social, economic, and religious forces that had sustained the brothel system for centuries were beginning to shift in ways that would eventually transform the landscape of sexuality, morality, and women's lives throughout Europe. The Black Death, which had already devastated much of the continent during the previous decade, continued to reshape social relationships and economic structures in ways that affected even the most marginalized members of society. The massive population losses had created labor shortages that gave surviving workers more bargaining power and mobility than they had possessed for generations. Even women in desperate circumstances found that they had more options than their predecessors had enjoyed. Margaret began to notice these changes in small but significant ways. Customers who had once treated the women with casual contempt now showed more concern for their comfort and satisfaction,
recognizing that attractive, skilled prostitutes were becoming scarcer and more valuable. Eleanor found herself competing with other brothel operators who offered better working conditions and more generous financial arrangements to women who possessed experience and established customer relationships. The church's attitude toward prostitution was also evolving, though in complex and sometimes contradictory directions. Some clergy members continued to preach traditional condemnations of sexual sin and moral corruption, but others began to emphasize themes of redemption and forgiveness that offered hope even to women in the most degraded circumstances. The rise of new religious movements that stressed personal relationships with God rather than institutional mediation created possibilities for spiritual renewal that didn't require formal ecclesiastical approval. Margaret experienced this religious transformation personally when she encountered Brother Francis, a Franciscan friar who regularly visited Southwark to minister to the poor and outcast. Unlike the priests who had previously condemned her while simultaneously ignoring her spiritual needs, Brother Francis approached her with genuine compassion and practical assistance. He offered not judgment but understanding, not demands for impossible reformation, but support for whatever positive changes she could realistically achieve. Through conversations with Brother Francis, Margaret began to reconsider her relationship with Christianity and her understanding of her own spiritual worth. She learned that God's love was not conditional upon social respectability or sexual purity, but was available to all people regardless of their circumstances or past actions. This revelation didn't change her material circumstances, but it restored a sense of inherent human dignity that years of degradation had nearly destroyed. The political landscape was also shifting in ways that affected the lives of women like Margaret. The traditional feudal hierarchies that had kept people locked into inherited social positions were weakening as emerging merchant classes gained economic power and political influence. Cities were growing larger and more diverse, creating opportunities for people to reinvent themselves and escape the constraints of their original circumstances. Margaret observed these changes through the evolving composition of Eleanor's customer base. Where once the clientele had consisted primarily of local merchants and craftsmen, she now encountered travelers from distant places, men whose wealth came from new forms of trade and finance rather than traditional land ownership. These customers often had different attitudes toward women and sexuality, viewing prostitution as a commercial transaction rather than a moral transgression. Some of these new customers were themselves social climbers who had risen from humble origins through intelligence, ambition, and good fortune. Their success stories suggested that dramatic changes in social position were becoming more possible, even for people who had started with significant disadvantages. Margaret began to consider whether similar opportunities might eventually become available to her, if she could survive long enough and accumulate the resources necessary to take advantage of them. The possibility of escape from prostitution had always seemed remote, but as Margaret entered her 4th year at Eleanor's establishment, she began to encounter women who had actually managed to leave the brothel world and create different lives for themselves. Some had married customers who were willing to overlook their past in exchange for companionship and domestic services. Others had accumulated enough money to purchase small businesses or to relocate to distant cities where their histories were unknown. These success stories were rare and often involved considerable luck, as well as careful planning, but their mere existence proved that permanent entrapment was not inevitable. Margaret began to study these examples carefully, trying to understand what factors had enabled some women to escape, while others remained trapped in circumstances that seemed to offer no alternatives. She noticed that successful escapees shared certain characteristics. They had maintained their health longer than average. They had developed skills that had value outside the brothel. They had accumulated some financial resources despite Eleanor's exploitative accounting system, and they had preserved enough hope and determination to take advantage of opportunities when they arose. Margaret began deliberately cultivating these characteristics in herself. She paid closer attention to her health, using the herbal knowledge Agnes had taught her to prevent illnesses that might weaken her or reduce her earning capacity. She practiced the literacy skills she had learned as a child, gradually improving her ability to read and write in ways that might prove valuable in different circumstances. She found ways to hide small amounts of money from Eleanor's detection, slowly building a reserve that might eventually provide the foundation for independence. Most importantly, Margaret began to cultivate relationships with customers who might potentially offer assistance beyond the immediate sexual transactions that brought them together. She identified men who seemed genuinely interested in her welfare, who possessed resources that could be helpful, and who might be willing to provide support for her transition to a different kind of life. This process required extreme delicacy and careful judgment. Margaret had to provide customers with the illusion of special intimacy and affection without creating expectations that could become dangerous or exploitative. She had to identify men who were genuinely capable of helping her while avoiding those who might make promises they couldn't or wouldn't keep. She had to balance hope with realism, ambition with caution. One customer who seemed particularly promising was Thomas Hardwell, a cloth merchant who had inherited his father's business and expanded it considerably through shrewd investments and careful management. Thomas was married but had no children, and he seemed to find in Margaret a combination of companionship and intellectual stimulation that his wife apparently couldn't provide. He began visiting more frequently and staying longer, engaging Margaret in conversations about literature, philosophy, and current events that went far beyond the usual customer interactions. Thomas claimed to be troubled by Margaret's circumstances and hinted that he might be willing to help her find alternatives to prostitution. He spoke about the possibility of setting her up as a seamstress or helping her relocate to another city where she could start fresh. Margaret listened to these suggestions with careful attention, trying to determine whether Thomas's interest was genuine or simply another version of the rescue fantasies that many customers projected onto the women they patronized. The relationship with Thomas developed over several months, during which Margaret gradually became more confident that his offers of assistance were sincere. He began providing her with small gifts that had practical value, lengths of fine fabric that could be sold, books that improved her literacy, coins that she could add to her hidden savings. He also shared information about his business operations and social connections that might prove useful if she ever attempted to establish herself in legitimate commerce. But as Margaret's hopes for escape began to seem more realistic, external circumstances were shifting in ways that would ultimately prove more significant than any individual customer's assistance. The medieval world that had created and sustained the brothel system was entering a period of fundamental transformation that would reshape the entire social landscape within which women like Margaret struggled to survive. The Renaissance was beginning to emerge in Italian cities, bringing with it new ideas about human dignity, individual potential, and social mobility that would eventually spread throughout Europe. The invention of printing was making books and literacy more widely available, creating opportunities for self-education that had previously been restricted to the wealthy and privileged. The expansion of trade was creating new forms of wealth and new social classes that challenged traditional hierarchies. Perhaps most importantly, changing attitudes toward women and sexuality were creating possibilities for redemption and social reintegration that had been virtually impossible in earlier periods. The rigid moral categories that had once divided women into saints and sinners were becoming more flexible, allowing for gradations of respectability that could accommodate reformed prostitutes under certain circumstances. Margaret's story might have ended in any number of ways: in death from disease or violence, in permanent entrapment within Eleanor's establishment, in successful escape to a different kind of life, or in some combination of triumph and tragedy that reflected the complex realities of survival in a harsh and unforgiving world. But whatever her individual fate, she represented thousands of women whose lives illustrated both the brutal constraints that medieval society imposed on its most vulnerable members and the remarkable resilience that enabled some of those members to survive and occasionally even transcend their circumstances. The brothel world that had shaped Margaret's young adulthood would eventually disappear, replaced by different forms of sexual commerce that reflected changing social attitudes and economic structures. But the fundamental questions raised by her experience about the relationship between individual choice and social constraint, about the possibilities for redemption and transformation, about the ways in which people create meaning and maintain dignity in the most difficult circumstances, would continue to resonate throughout human history. Margaret's legacy lay not in any single achievement or dramatic escape, but in her representation of the countless women who faced similar challenges with courage, intelligence, and an unshakable determination to survive with whatever humanity they could preserve. Their stories, largely unrecorded by the historians who focused on kings and battles, constituted an essential part of the medieval experience and continue to offer insights into the eternal human struggle to find hope and meaning in the midst of suffering and injustice. In the end, the true measure of Margaret's life was not whether she succeeded in escaping her circumstances, but whether she maintained her essential humanity while enduring them. And in that struggle, her story serves as both a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a reminder of the social responsibilities we bear toward those who find themselves trapped in circumstances beyond their control.